unfortunately, my bursary just yet. Because these are British soldiers' uniforms from the French and Indian War, when New Jersey and the other British colonies were British colonies. And this place was constructed to house these folks. The French and Indian War was the fourth war to have been fought here in America between the French and the British. The first was in the 1690s, the second was at the turn of the 18th century, the third was at the end of the 1730s, going into the 40s. So in 1754, when the French and Indian War broke out, one thing we need to know is the colonies had already been pretty used to fighting wars. And this earlier war is basically all of the fighting was done by people who came here from America. So basically, your provincial regiments raised by the various British colonies would be raised for short periods of time, 9 to 12 months. And that's because armies in the 18th century did not want to fight in the wintertime. It's just too dangerous. If you're caught outside in the winter, you can watch soldiers catch sick and die. So armies in the 18th century would usually seek what was known as winter quarters. Now back in Europe, we've got these huge field armies constantly moving around each other. That's a very anxious period. They have to break down to smaller pieces to actually hit places. It's very difficult to get their supplies to them. They have to be constantly vigilant against raids and skirmishes. It's a scary time in Europe. But here in America, there's a huge buffer zone of wilderness between, say, French settled areas and British settled areas. And it's pretty well impenetrable by either side's forces come, say, like December. So the colonies found they just didn't need armies in the wintertime. They could disband the regiments, send those people home. That way they don't have to pay the wages, find food for them, find shelter. It's just send them home. And if there's still a war next year and a reason to mount another campaign, they can pass new laws in the spring, raise the regiments again, and be ready to campaign again once the weather clears up enough to go. It's a way of sort of fighting the war on the cheap. Now, in the 1750s, during the French and Indian War, for the first time ever, the British government made it a policy of sending many thousands of regular soldiers here to North America from their regular army. There had been for a long time standing the faction in the parliament which wanted to sort of more emphasize the empire over, say, conflicts in mainland Europe, but they didn't really hold sway into the 50s. But once they do hold that sway, they want to make the empire bigger. They want to overwhelm the French here in America. And in 1756, after the French and the British formally declared war against each other and sparked what is known there as the 7 Years' War, the bloodiest war of the 18th century, France was going to be too distracted with that than to commit soldiers here to America. But Britain is an island. They can send as many soldiers as they want because they've got the best navy in the world to keep their shores safe. So over time, they sent something like 20,000 regulars here to America with the idea of overwhelming the French and seizing that French territory, which means they send this great big sledgehammer army here, but that creates a number of new challenges. Like, what do you do with those guys in the wintertime? Because unlike the provincial troops, you can just send home. Now, you do have to find a place to put those guys. And the British have long-standing rules about how soldiers can be quartered in British towns. There's a long-standing British constitutional fear of armies as profoundly dangerous. There's a lot of rules that have to be used. They have to be quartered in public houses if they're around, or barracks if they're around. That's basically your only two options, which works well in Britain. There's well-established towns there. There's taverns all over the place. There were sometimes centuries old by that point. They're big, they're massive. You can put a lot of guys in them. When you get here in America, that infrastructure just doesn't exist. 95% of people lived and worked on farms. You just didn't have the urban density to require big taverns. So there was a big political disaster trying to find quarters for those soldiers for the first couple of years. That gets solved in 1758 when the British government decides to just subsidize the colonial expenses. They were going to recompense American expenses in gold and silver specie, hard gold and silver money. Something very hard to find here in the colonies because of the economy. The first year of 1758, they offered 133,000 pounds of gold and silver specie, and in response to that, the colonies began to spend as much money as they could to do whatever was necessary for the war effort. New Jersey went from being extremely reluctant to spend any money at all on British soldiers to spending as much money as they could in that same, first section in '58, voting in early 1758 to build 5 barracks. One here at Trenton, one at Perth Amboy, one at New Brunswick, one at Elizabethtown, and one at Burlington. All 5 gone except for this one. This is the last remaining of those 5 barracks. A bunch of the colonies built barracks in the same period for pretty much the same reasons, but of all those, this is the only one left. So it's a really rare surviving witness to a lot of things, not only the Battle of Trenton, but also just the French and Indian War and New Jersey as a British colony. But when this place is built, it was constructed with 20 rooms like this inside, fitted out for 10 to 18 soldiers per room. Which might seem kind of cramped. It's a lot better than getting the soldiers' tent in this room. Imagine the British Army and the Continental Army later would administratively break up regiments and companies into 5 to 6 man groups known as messes. This is where mess hall comes from later, because those messes, among other things, would share a tin kettle in which they could eat their food out. That's where mess hall comes from later. But they'd also share things like an axe to cut their firewood. They would share a couple of blankets together, and they would share a tent together. So when you come to a place like this, distribute the space in the building, same basic blocks, distribute the space in the encampment with. And those fellows who used to share a tent now share a bunk together. So you might get 3 to a bed, you might get 6 to a bunk.
Oh my.
But that's quite a bit more space than you get in that tent. Because a soldier's tent had a 7-foot square for its floors. Imagine these beds are a little over 6 feet by 4 feet. We can sort of visualize a 7-foot square by dragging this bedpost down to here. We can imagine 7 feet. And that might be shared by 5 or 6 soldiers. You know, that's pretty cramped. The other thing is, the only thing you get for bedding in a tent like that, if you're lucky enough to get it, is exposed straw, which is certainly a lot more insulating and soft than sleeping directly on the ground. It's way less hard on your joints, but it's abrasive stuff. And soldiers only had 3 or 4 shirts that lasted through the year. It's important to consider in the 18th century, these shirts, they're your underwear, but also your primary means of cleaning yourself. Immersion bathing is just not really possible. So you sponge bathe and you change your shirt every 24 hours. It will pull off the dirts and the bio oils, and you'll stay relatively clean, you know, clean enough to remain healthy at any rate. But it does mean you do need a shirt to change into. You need to preserve them. And uniforms are a relatively new invention. In the 1750s, it's still within living memory that the British Army even adopted a sort of standard uniform. That was a French pioneering thing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The British had adopted it afterwards. So they still have all of their original meaning, which is to look as dramatic and showy as possible, represent the power of the state's capacity to raise resources and money and organize things like national armies. That's a new thing too. And so you need to look